Okay, so at last we come to the elephant in the room, which is the condition of the main drive flywheel. As we saw in previous episodes, we did have to do some repair to the pinch roller, to the rubber on that, to try and make it run true. But the drive roller is a bit of a different issue. Not so much in we still have a significant amount of degradation of the rubber, but more so in that we can't actually remove the flywheel in order to address the problem easily. And that's because the flywheel sits within this cast framework here, which is bolted to the chassis, and it also forms the pivot point for the tape release mechanism. And even when this is completely removed, the flywheel is contained within this mechanism and retained within the mechanism, not only by its bearing, but also by this lever. So you can't take the flywheel out. It was obviously assembled and then a pin driven through from the underside of the casting, which obviously is not possible to remove now without the risk of damaging the casting itself. And if we did that, then the whole machine would effectively be scrapped. So chatting to the owner, he has decided that he doesn't wish to risk that, so we're going to leave it as is. And as you can see, there is significant degradation of it. I have tried to true this up as best I can. I've also treated the rubber with various restorers, and although the rubber does have some give in it, it is hard, it has contracted, and it is not completely true. And the upshot of that is that as it drives off the motor, there is some significant wow and flutter within the audio quality, and I will demonstrate that to you in due course. If you really wanted to get this sorted, I think it's probably a specialist job to have this stripped away, this bonded rubber, and have new rubber bonded to it. I think you would also need to run the risk of either drilling out this pin or cutting the arm away from the chassis, in other words cutting through the pin, and then reinstalling a pin once you had finished with the flywheel and it was back in place. That is really the only option, but I don't know anywhere in the UK that would bond new rubber to these sorts of flywheels. You know, they need a lot more research or come up with some sort of method to do it, and that's kind of beyond the scale of this restoration. Okay, here we are then. The Truvox is all back together again. The resistor packs have now been changed, and they've made a big difference to the amount of thermal stress the machine is undergoing when it's in play. And so now we come to the biggest problem with the unit, which I described a little bit earlier on, and that is the amount of wow and flutter due to the imbalance of the main flywheel, and that's caused by the rubber degradation, as we've already discussed. So what I've done here is I've recorded a test tone onto the machine, and I'm now going to play it, and hopefully you'll be able to pick this up on the microphone as to the amount of warble there is on the machine. Now don't forget, this is worse obviously because we recorded it on this machine, so you've got one pass of the wow and flutter, and now we're replaying it, so there's wow and flutter on top of wow and flutter, if you catch my meaning. Now, in order to record on the machine, it is quite an odd system in that on the right hand side here there's a record switch which you have to enable. That will then cut the sound from the speaker So you then need to match the levels according to the magic eye, which is down on the front of the machine on the left here. And then obviously when you record, you can't hear what you're recording through the speaker here. So it's really designed as a recorder on top of an existing setup. So you would take an auxiliary out or something like that, record it, and then play it back. And also obviously that helps with feedback and things like that from the main speaker itself. So let's hear what this test tone sounds like. I'll just bring the volume up. Obviously there's a fair bit of machine noise on here because the machine, you know, we're quite close to the speaker. So that warble you can hear is the speed of rotation of the main flywheel inside. As you can hear on a simple test tone, it really does show it off to its absolute worst. Okay, so what I'll do now is I've also recorded some music, some synth music that I made a few years ago to avoid any copyright. So I'll reposition the tape and then bring you back and we can listen to what it actually sounds like with music, you know, some sort of musical content. Okay, so I've repositioned the tape and let's hear what it sounds like in a musical context. So as you can hear, in a musical context, you certainly get that analog vibe. It's obviously not as noticeable as when you've just got a single tone playing there, where you know it really does authenticate or emphasize the wow and the flutter. But even so, it is there, and that is, I'm afraid, as much as you can do with a machine like this, without going for that next stage of restoration where you're actively, you know, removing the main flywheel, either trying to recoat it yourself or sending it away. So what we're going to do finally then is to button this thing up and put it back in its original case, and I'll show you what that looks like once I've done it. And then I think for the last thing we'll do is we'll just have a look then at all the components that have been removed, how much we've actually changed, and then we'll have a look at how much that would cost, and then have a bit of a discussion as to whether or not it was worth it. Okay, just in for completeness sake, I've put out all of the components that we've changed. So starting off, we had about 8 electrolytic capacitors, 2 in each of these big cans for smaller values. About 10 quid's worth there. We've got a bunch of polycaps, which we've changed out. Actually 8 of those as well, so call that about another tenner. We've got a bunch of smaller value resistors. I did have to change off camera 3 of the resistors associated with the output tube. We'll talk about that in a moment, because I was having some problems with the output of the machine. So there's, I don't know, about 5 quid's worth there. One of the bigger expenditures was the replacement of the 2 large dropper resistors. So we used 8 of these 14 watt wire wound resistors. So what's that? That's about 14 quid for those resistors. We also had to replace the switch pot, and we put a new on-off switch, a new inline fuse holder, and some capacitor protection on the input. So I mean, that little lot, who knows, probably about, plus all the wiring that we had to change, about a tenner there. We also had the 6BW6, which was dead from the start. That's actually quite a cheap tube, £4.50. And the other tube that I was just talking about is the output tube. And whilst this tested serviceable but weak, when I was giving it some long-term burning, it was getting very, very hot. Associated with changing these resistors, I've had to change this as well. So we've got a new output tube in now. I've gone for the cheapest one, which is 22 quid. So altogether, that makes a grand total of £77.50. Well, what do you get for that? Well, you get a really quite a nice valve amplifier with tone control, mono obviously, but still I would say you know, a nice piece of a kit to have. You also do get a working 1/4 inch tape machine, albeit with the limitation as we discussed, which is the wow and flutter associated with the main flywheel being out of true. Of course, the one thing that we haven't discussed is how long all this takes, plus all the other associated equipment that you need in order to you know, undertake a restoration project like this, test equipment and the like. I don't know how many hours I've spent on it, but it must be perhaps 60, 70 hours, which means that to bring a tape recorder like this back to life is really not commercially viable, because if you're going to pay somebody to do it, even at a minimum rate, you know, you're talking, what, £1,000 just for the labour alone. So they are a bit of a labour of love, these. This is why they're becoming increasingly rare, especially these older models, perhaps not so well known, non-professional models like the Reeboks. But I would still argue that for the amount of money we've spent on it, we have a usable bit of kit that hopefully is going to be around for a good few years yet. And, you know, for its rarity value and the interest, I still think it was worth the effort and the time and the money. So that about wraps this up. I'll leave a few photos at the end of this of the unit back in its case. But anyway, I hope that you found this interesting and informative, and I hope that it does help somebody in the future if they find one, to at least have a few thoughts about where to begin and whether or not to begin and what's involved in bringing one of these things back to life.